it's been a very busy ASCO, like always, like every year, with thousands of communications that all seem important, and it's very hard to actually draw one or two or three. But I did my best to look at some of the aspects that I'm usually focusing when I go to ASCO. So I'm going to talk about three studies that were presented and that had actually important practice changing information. So let's go ahead. So the first study that I wanted to give a short update on is a study in breast cancer. And this was a phase 3, and the name of the study is Serena 6. And it's in hormone positive, HER2 negative, advanced breast cancer patients that received first line therapy. So this type of breast cancer is actually the most common type of breast cancer within this disease, and the patients are treated with a standard of care in the first line. They receive an aromatase inhibitor plus a CDK4/6 inhibitor. So what they did in the study, while these patients were treated with standard of care, they were actually monitored by regular blood sampling for looking at ctDNA. What they wanted to do is basically to detect progression while the patients are treated with the first line standard of care before the patients exhibit actually clinical or radiological progression, which I think is great because you basically look at these patients at very early progression. And once that mutation was detected in circulating tumor DNA, which is also extremely important because it's a minimally invasive way of finding that. You don't need to do any biopsies. You don't need tissue. You just draw blood. So these patients don't have to go through a lot of biopsies, which can be, obviously super invasive for those patients. So once the mutation was identified through ctDNA, the patients were randomized. A part of them remain on the standard of care therapy that they were on until then, or they were switched to a new drug, a new selective estrogen receptor degrader, a new SERD, how we call it. And the name of that is camizestrant. And they continued the CDK4 inhibitor treatment. And the results were actually extremely in favor of the novel IP. So what we saw, the primary endpoint for the study was progression-free survival. And all the time points, median progression-free survival at 16 months, progression-free survival at 12 months, and at 24 months, they were all in favor of the investigational arm. So what I can say is that by switching these patients to camizestrant, plus, CDK4/6 inhibitors, basically this reduced by 56% the risk of progression or death, which is quite significant. As a result of that, this is really practice changing. Identifying this mutation early before the patients exhibit clinical progression is very important, and it's also important that is possible to be done via ctDNA, so no invasive techniques. And because of this, camizestrant actually received FDA breakthrough therapy designation right away. The second study that I wanted to see the results, and this is a 5-year outcomes update, is in metastatic melanoma. The drug, this is basically a cell therapy. The study doesn't have a fancy name, but it's basically C14401 trial. And the drug is called lifileucel. And the patient, this is a phase 2 study. And as I mentioned, this is 5-year results, update of the 5-year results. And this is in a patient population in advanced melanoma with unresectable metastatic disease that was previously treated with checkpoint inhibitor and or BRAF targeted therapy if the patients needed that. So after the patient relapse or metastasize after those therapies, there are very few treatment options left for those patients. So that's why this therapy is actually very important. And this was a single arm study. And what lifileucel is a tumor, it's a TILS type of therapy. So after the lymphodepleting regimen is administered. And also, I think they also had interleukin 2 support. The primary endpoint of the study was overall response rates. It was, again, the overall response rates were 31.4% of the patients responded, which is actually a great number, considering that these patients were after a standard of care and also the non-resectable and metastatic disease. The median duration of response was remarkable. It was 36.5 months. And the 5-year survival was also 19.7%. It's also remarkable that these patients experienced like a massive tumor burden reduction. In 79.3% of the patients, they observed tumor burden reduction. This drug actually offers an option, a very feasible option for treatment for these patients that don't have too many options left, these melanoma patients. And as a result, the regulatory status of this drug changed. FDA granted accelerated approval for this drug in 2024. The third study that I wanted to talk about is in multiple myeloma, and although there are a lot of treatment options there, it's still not a curable option for these patients. And what was interesting for me, the name of the study is called Magnetism 6 trial, and it is a new bispecific antibody, elranatamab. And the study is actually done in newly diagnosed patients with multiple myeloma, which is interesting. And it's for the patients that are not transplant eligible. And this was basically just the interim results. So the study is not finished, it's ongoing. And these were interim results presented at ASCO. And they were treated with a combination of this new bispecific anti-BCMA and CD3 antibody that is called elranatamab, and combined with two drugs that have been on the multiple myeloma landscape for a long time, lenalidomide and daratumumab. And they looked at overall response rates, they looked at safety and tolerability, and overall response rates were impressive, like 97.3% of the patients responded. And in terms of safety, so these are all very promising results for these patients. And in terms of safety, most of them experienced a variety of adverse events, but they were all manageable. They were not high grades. Most of them were lower grades. And they also had cytokine release syndrome. Most of those patients had grade 1, 2, so no lower grades and also manageable. But about 62% of the patients experienced cytokine release syndrome, which is important to know. So right now, in terms of the regulatory status, it is still investigational. There will be a phase 3. I think there will be a phase 3 study that will need a comparison with the standard of care in this patient population. But right now the results are promising, and they will follow with more results probably later in the year or next year at ASCO. Looking at these studies and looking at what triggers regulatory approval is basically patient outcomes. So once a molecule is practice changing through a good safety profile and also looking at the primary endpoints, it's very important to have a well-written protocol that will highlight the patient outcomes and as well make sure that the safety aspects are very well addressed. But I think having a well-written protocol with clear primary endpoints and objectives will certainly, and clear eligibility criteria is certainly one of the biggest requirements in order to have successful studies. That would be my advice.